All right, that's me kind of yelling. All right, here's my normal voice. Adequate. Okay, so I promised a quick debrief on exam 2. Okay, so here's an overview of the exam results with the extra credit points. So you can see that, and this is raw numbers of students who got certain grades. So the far left column is 90% and up. So that's your A's. B, 80 to 89%. And the next column, C, 70 to 79, 60 to 69, and less than 59. So it's not a perfect normal distribution. I like it as a distribution because, like I said, it's got a push to the A's and the B's and the C's, and that's what I like to see. With the extra credit, the class average is a 76%. With the without extra credit, it was a 73%. And what's going on is that in this less than 59%, there's quite a tail out in terms of grades. And that's what pulls the average down. Without that big, long tail, we'd have a higher average overall. The overall grades look good. There were a few questions that kind of looked at because there's some problems. This is one of those questions. What selects for dark skin color in equatorial population? Populations exposed to high UV radiation. Answer number 1, dark skin allows for higher rates of vitamin D synthesis with less UV exposure. Is that correct? No, it's not correct. It is incorrect. It's light skin that allows for higher rates of vitamin D synthesis. And on an alternate question that asks about what selects for light skin in higher latitudes away from the equator, that was the correct answer. And you know what? Most people got that right. So my assumption here is that people are not reading the answers thoroughly, because you can see the correct answer is dark skin minimizes folate loss due to UV exposure. But most people picked, or slightly more people picked, all of the answers are correct. Okay? And my interpretation is people read the answers and went, oh, there's all of these, and just chose it. There's a couple others where the answer distribution is not what I would want, and it's because a lot of people chose all of these are correct, when they aren't correct. So just because you see all of these are correct, don't default to thinking that's the correct answer. I use it as much as a distractor answer as it is the correct answer. Right? So you have to read all the answers carefully. That is why I'm not tossing this question. It's clearly, in my mind, and I talked about it with the TAs, structured. It's that distraction. All of these are correct. People are just honing in on that and answering that. Does anybody else have any other take on it? I'm interested. Writing multiple choice questions is not an easy thing to do. Writing questions that are clear, but are a little bit more than just asking you to regurgitate memorized facts, right? And writing answers are the most difficult, is actually the most difficult part. So this question, right? This was also a question that was concerning. And I'm not sure if it's the fact that in the answers we had stuff like family hominidae, which was the most popular answer. But who belongs to family hominidae? Who are the hominids? That's apes and humans, not monkeys, right? So I don't know if it was the fact that you've got the, group and then the name, if that's what caused confusion. But monkeys, apes, and humans, said several times, are the anthropoids. They are the anthropoids, and they belong to Anthropoidea. Anybody have any thoughts on this question? I think it's a pretty straightforward question given the material given to you, but if somebody has a different take. Would it have made a difference if after the answer there had been like family hominidae and then parentheses, hominids? Infraorder Anthropoidea, parentheses, anthropoid. Would that have changed the way people answered? You think it would have? Okay. All right, take that into consideration. And then this one, this is the only one that really kind of gives me pause. Forests is found in Africa and Asia, became nocturnal due to competition with monkeys during the day. This shift in adaptation is an example of character displacement. Okay. So it was a pretty straightforward concept, evolutionary concept discussed in class. I don't think it's covered particularly well in the textbook, but we did discuss it in class. It was in the presentations. Acclimatization, that's adaptation over the course of a lifetime. So that certainly wouldn't apply. Heterozygote advantage is genetic. And adaptive radiation would mean adaptation to a wide range. The answers here kind of make me think that people really weren't sure of this question. Anybody have any thoughts? Okay. Well, that is that. Now we're going to pick up and finish talking about speciation. Gotta go. Probably should go back. There's a lot of clicking. We get rid of the Zoom. Yeah, thank you. All right, so there's some different types of speciation or patterns by which speciation occurs. So we talked about types of selection that can produce speciation, how they can operate on a population, how environment, selective pressures, and reproductive isolation produce speciation, right? But let's look at the patterns or sort of the modes of speciation. And this, oh, I'm not getting mine. It is not. It was working for you earlier. Maybe it just hates me. Huh? Thank you. All right, so the idea of phyletic gradualism. And this is sort of how Darwin conceived of evolution, and this is how a lot of people, when you conceive of evolution, one species giving rise to another species, giving rise to another species, slowly over time. We have time on the y-axis or the vertical axis, and morphology on the x or the horizontal axis. And so as you get from time, deep time, whatever, early to late, you're going to get a change in morphology. And so you start with easily recognizable species A. It's the oldest and has a particular morphological pattern. And through time, it transitions or changes, evolves into species B, right, with a different morphological pattern or something distinct about the morphological pattern that sets it apart from A. And it is also later or more recent in time. And then you have, again, the same process by which you get a gradual evolution into species C, which is the most recent of the three species. So you have three species, all part of the same lineage, right? A is ancestral to B, B is ancestral to C, and it's an evolving lineage. But we run into the issue with each species sort of be an arbitrary division. Where does species A, stop being A and start being B? When does B stop being B and start being C? Exactly where does the transition or that speciation event occur? Right? And oftentimes, because the fossil record is incomplete, because we have fossils that represent so few individuals, we don't have fossils from every individual or even every species that ever lived. So therefore, sometimes we get what look like blanks in the evolutionary record or archaeological fossil record. And people used to always talk about missing links. That language has been dropped somewhat because we understand how evolution works better today. But this is one way that evolution is conceived of happening. And it used to be the predominant way that evolution was believed to occur. Like, this is how it happened. You started with an ancestral species, you ended up with a descendant species, and stuff happened along the way. You just had to find the pieces in between, or the species that fit in between. However, there's also branching evolution. And branching evolution is where an ancestral species, A, can give rise to multiple descendant species. Multiple descendant species, right? And this is branching evolution. This would be clearly an example of disruptive selection, creating two new species from an original ancestral species. Yes? Exactly, yes. So branching evolution like this, which probably happened a lot in evolutionary history because we know of a number of examples where this has happened fairly recently. We can look to Darwin's finches on the Galapagos, where you get adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is like hyper branching evolution. Right? And as you just mentioned, the lemurs on Madagascar are also another example of adaptive radiation. We get this rapid branching and branching and branching, and many, many species descendant from an ancestral species. Many species descendant from an ancestral species. Right? So branching evolution is another way that evolution can occur. So the mode and tempo of evolution is not simply linear. It can occur in different ways. Now, we also have the idea that evolution may not always be just a slow, ever so slow change from species A to species B. Maybe there's a different tempo or time in geological sense, different temporal pattern to the way evolution occurs. And so going from species A to species B to species C, for this slow, gradual change from one species to another may not actually be how this, what looks like in the fossil record, may not actually be how it occurred. It may actually be that species A is static. It is morphologically static because it is well adapted to its environment, and it stays that way for quite a while. But then something happens, and we get punctuated, rapid speciation event that occurs. And last class we talked about speciation, the evolution of new species along the fringes of a species sort of core territory. So if you have groups that are adapting to those marginalized environments, they might make them better evolved, better adapted for life in the core part of the territory or region where species live, right? If you have to adapt to crappier conditions, chances are you're going to be pretty well adapted for living in the good conditions as well, and perhaps have traits that make you more reproductively successful. So the idea is that in the fossil record, you see a species that seems static through time, and then bam, all of a sudden it looks like there's a new species on the landscape, B. But it's clearly linked to species A. So if you have punctuated equilibrium, where you get rapid speciation events, maybe these groups on the periphery and the fringes adapting to the harsher environments, then once the speciation is complete, or during that process, they come back into that core area and they basically take over. They either swamp out by interbreeding with, or they completely replace the ancestral species. Right? Now, when I say that this happens, like it happens over 10 years or 20 years, hundreds of thousands of years, very long time periods. But to us, geologically, when we're looking at hundreds of millions of years, right, or in the case of human evolution, 7 to 8 million years, right, these things can happen fairly rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of years looks like a little blip in a geological time frame. Right? So the idea here is, instead of, again, that gradual evolution, that you have stasis in a species followed by rapid speciation events. Stasis followed by rapid speciation events. This is the idea of punctuated equilibrium. We probably have evolution occurring, speciation, in a number of different ways. It could happen gradually over time. It could happen fairly rapidly with branching evolution or adaptive radiation. And it can also happen via punctuated equilibrium. Rapid speciation events followed by stasis. But oftentimes we see very similar patterns in the fossil records. We have to learn to distinguish those differences. And sometimes it's not always possible. Here's an example with some lovely snails of punctuated equilibrium. So you have a snail species here, right? The living snails are on the ground surface. Their remains of those that are deceased, you can see them below the ground surface. So those are the fossils that they would leave behind. Essentially, their shells would fossilize. And that they are in stasis. Things are good. Then you have a large population and a fringe population. And the fringe has become physically isolated from the core part of the population. But they're still the same. They're all making the same sorts of fossils for the fossil record. Then we start to see a change because of the environmental differences in the region that the isolated population is. Right? Those pressures could be food pressures, it could be climate, it could be predation, any number, sexual selection could start to play, any number of different selective forces could be operating. But it's a different selective force operating on the isolated group than from what's operating on the core group that is still adapted to that core environment. So we get change in the isolated group, and it can happen fairly rapidly. Right? And so what we start to see is that the fossils look pretty similar still, and then you get the reintroduction of the isolated group that has undergone speciation back into the core area, right? And the fossils that we're seeing are still pretty much all from the core population, the original ancestral population, because they're the large population. That's what's going to predominate. And as you recall, fossilization is rare. It is not the rule. You get a very small sample of things that have lived in the past. Then ultimately, the population from the new area that had to adapt to perhaps more challenging environmental conditions or more challenging selective pressures are actually better adapted for life even in the core area. So they come back in and they wipe out or replace or genetically swamp through interbreeding the original ancestral population. So then we get fossil. It looks like it was just like boom, boom, magic change, one to the other. When in fact, this was a process that took hundreds of thousands of years and occurred through punctuated equilibrium. Right? I know snails are not excited, but makes sense as an explanation of both what we see in terms of the fossil record and how punctuated equilibrium could work, and how probably it happens a lot more often than we realize from the fossil record. Right. Any questions? Right. All right, so now we're going to look at the hallmarks of bipedalism and the origins of bipedalism. Right, some of this will overlap a little bit with what you've been doing in lab this week, but not everybody has had lab. There's still 4 lab classes to meet today, and I have a little bit more information that I integrate into my hallmarks of bipedalism than what you get in lab. So I want to make sure we hit on all of it. It's pretty critical for understanding how do we know a fossil species used bipedalism for locomotion, similar, or at least sort of similar to you and I, because that makes us unique in the order Primates, that we utilize bipedalism. We are actually obligatory bipeds, right? We can't really use quadrupedalism to locomote. We can use suspensory locomotion, right? You can get up on the monkey bars, which really should be called the 8 bars, and swing underneath, right? We can do that, but it gets tiring, right? We're really not designed for that long haul. What we can do over the long haul is walk on our lower limbs, and it is actually a very efficient mode of locomotion. We can do this for a very long time without significantly tiring, right? So bipedalism is a very efficient mode of locomotion. We can't run as fast as a dog or a horse, but in the long run, we can often outwalk them, right? Because it is a more efficient mode of locomotion. So we are obligatory bipeds, and that separates us from the other members of the order Primates who use vertical clinging and leaping, arboreal or terrestrial quadrupedalism, or suspensory behavior. Or if they're using some format like apes, gorillas, and chimps, knuckle walk. Orangutans use fist walking. Not actually on their knuckles, they walk on the sides of their fists with their forelimbs. But we're the only ones that truly use this obligatory form of bipedalism. So this separates us, and this is also what distinguishes our ancestors from the last common ancestor with the apes, right? We're so closely genetically related to chimps and bonobos that we are grouped with them in taxonomy. We are taxonomically grouped with chimps and bonobos because we are more closely related to them than chimps and bonobos are to gorillas. Right? That is how closely related we are. And then we with gorillas are more closely related to each other than gorillas are to orangutans. So we share this very close genetic relationship, but they can't do obligatory bipedalism like we can, right? So our ancestors, this is what sets our ancestors apart. So we want to be able to identify bipedal locomotor behavior in the fossil record, because that's going to tell us who our earliest ancestors, or at least evolutionary relatives, are. Right? They may not be directly ancestral to us, as we're going to see in some cases, but we do belong to the same family tree. All right, so we're going to look at the hallmarks or the indicators of bipedalism. And we're going to do this by comparing human morphology, skeletal morphology, and ape skeletal morphology. Sometimes it'll be a chimpanzee, sometimes it'll be a gorilla. But basically they basically have the same pattern, chimps and gorillas. It's mostly chimps. Sometimes it's a gorilla. We'll do that comparison. In particular, we are going to look at the skull. We're going to look at the pelvis. We're going to look at the knee. We're going at the femur and the knee. And we're going to look at the foot. And we're going to look at teeth. Okay? We're going to look at the distinct differences, the things that are associated, either directly necessary for bipedal locomotion or associated with bipedal locomotion. And then we're going to look at the origin of the hominins. Where did these earliest hominins come from? What is the evolutionary scenario? So I'm going to do a whiz through about 60 million years of primate evolution in 4 slides, just so you get the general gist of it, and then talk about where these earliest hominins come from. And we have evidence for the earliest hominin, or an ape-like creature that used bipedal locomotion to some degree from about 7 million years ago. Pretty deep time. We're going to look at the environmental change at the end of the Miocene. If you look at the long history of life on Earth, you'll see that environmental change, either warming or cooling periods on Earth, are associated with major changes in species on the planet. Right? Extreme warming and extreme cooling are associated with major extinction events throughout evolutionary history in terms of life on Earth. Now, this doesn't like me. All right. So again, we're going to look at the skull, pelvis, the knee, foot, and teeth. So the human, pretty clear. The animal on the right is a gorilla. So we're going to look at the skull, the pelvis, the knee, and the foot. And then we're going to look at the teeth. Okay, this is just a quick overview. So this is human versus chimp. This is about the position of the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the big hole. Foramen magnum literally translates from Latin to English, big hole, right? That is on the base of our cranium, like on the most inferior aspect, where the brainstem enters the cranial vault. The brainstem enters the cranial vault, right? So in humans, it is directly underneath the cranium. So it's very anterior. Because we are bipeds, we stand upright. In order to maintain our center of gravity, which basically drops right through the center of our head, through that foramen magnum, down your spinal column, through, basically between your legs, to a point between your legs, so that we can stand upright. Okay? That reflects our center of gravity. So in order for us to be upright all the time, which is associated with bipedalism, even sitting as a biped, your thorax and abdomen are completely upright, as is your neck and your head above. You need that foramen magnum underneath the skull for anterior position. Whereas in a chimpanzee, it's going to be more posteriorly positioned. So it's more towards the back. They are quadrupeds. You're going to spend time on all fours, even if it's knuckle walking, right? And the spinal cord's coming out closer to the back of the cranial vault and moving posteriorly, or what's called caudally, to the tail. Okay? So when we see a foramen magnum that is more anterior in position, or directly underneath the cranium, that indicates bipedal locomotion. Also, a trait that is not directly related to bipedalism, but is associated with bipedalism, is a more rounded or arched palate shape. A more rounded or arched palate shape, whereas when we look at apes, monkeys too, most animals, we see that they have a more rectangular palate. In particular, those posterior tooth rows are virtually parallel lines of teeth on either side, the premolars and the molars. Whereas in humans, even all the way back to the molars and premolars and molars, you have an arched palate shape. So while an arched palate shape is not necessary for bipedalism, it is typical of what we see in bipedal form. Human versus chimp, the pelvis. The pelvis is critical because this is where muscles stabilize the hip as well as propulsory muscles for locomotion using the lower limbs are anchored. And in humans, we have a broad but short pelvis. It's basically a bowl-shaped pelvis, broad but short. Whereas in chimpanzees, you have a tall but fairly narrow. Tall but fairly narrow. A couple things going on here. First is locomotion itself, bipedalism. In order to hold the trunk up above the pelvis, right, you need stabilizers, muscles that can hold the trunk up. And for much of that, you have the gluteal muscles, gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, aka your butt muscles, right? And they are attaching on the top of the ilium and then running down and inserting on the proximal femur. If you have a long ilium or a tall os coxa or hip bone, then those muscles are going to be really long. And they have to contract to hold the trunk upright. Whereas if you're a quadruped, it's not a big deal, and actually you get a lot of propulsion out of those muscles. Whereas if you have a short ilium, so a short os coxa or hip bone, those muscles are fairly short, and they don't really have to contract very much, and for them to maintain the upright position. And so muscles that are contracting take energy. So in order to have an upright posture that you're going to need for bipedalism, you need that short hip bone associated with the shorter muscles. Okay? Also, humans give birth to big-headed babies. Right? Relative to other species, the heads of the babies are quite large. And so you need a sort of bowl-shaped pelvis with a larger pelvic inlet and outlet in the center here than you do for a chimpanzee. Remember, chimpanzees have brain sizes 3 times the size of expected for a mammal of their size. Humans have brain sizes 6 times expected for a mammal of our size, the encephalization quotient. And basically, a big chunk of that is already present at birth. So about 50% of overall head size is present at birth. By the time a child is 4, 90% of all the brain matter has developed. Right? It's a matter of organization from then on, but really large-brained infants, rapid brain growth, but that is something associated with humans, so you'll have to accommodate that large-headed baby. Right? And obviously, men don't give birth, but when you have 2 sexes in a species, they're very tightly linked. Right? You can get dimorphism, but you still have to have the commonalities. So there are distinct differences in the pelvis between males and females in order for females to have the birth canal necessary to give birth to big-headed babies. But males also have to have a similar sort of architecture to the pelvis. So this is a big difference. And you'll see in most quadrupeds, you get this tall, narrow pelvis. Now, differences in the legs. We have differences in the femur. In humans, chimps, or gorillas, the femur drops straight down from the pelvis, straight down to the knee, whereas in humans, the proximal femur at the hip angles out, the longer neck, it angles out, and then the shaft of the femur angles medially to the knee. So there you can see the straight drop of the chimp on the right, and the angle, that medial angle of the femur to the knee in the human. This is called the valgus or medial angle. And the key here is that when you're standing, right, remember that center of gravity is between your legs. So the femora angle medially towards the knee to help you maintain that center of gravity so that you can stay upright. This is a comfortable standing position. Chimps, gorillas, bonobos, when they get upright, because the femur drops straight down from the hips to the knee, they have this really wide-legged stance. Because they're trying to keep their center of gravity up, when in reality their center of gravity is more forward, right? And it drops straight down, so when they walk, it's a very awkward bipedal gait, like this. Whereas you and I stop, and because our center of gravity is underneath our pelvis, and the fact that our femora angle medially to the knee, you have perfect center of gravity for a bipedal locomotion. Yes. Reducing pressure on the knee? I don't think so. It might, but I don't think so. And then we also have some distinct differences in the foot, right? Chimpanzees have a divergent first digit in the foot, just like we have in the hand, and they have in the hand as well. Whereas humans do not have a divergent first digit. Chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, other non-human primates have a grasping foot. A grasping foot, just like they have a grasping hand. Right? So their foot grasps like our hand does. Our foot is designed to be stable. It is a platform for us to walk upon. A platform. And so we see that there is not a divergent first digit in the human foot, while that chimp foot, you'd be hard-pressed to distinguish it from a chimp hand if you didn't really know what you were looking at, because it looked very much like it. And notice the very long bones for the toes in the chimp foot, right? Long, whereas human toe bones are short and straight. The human foot has evolved for being a platform and also for propulsion. That first digit or the big toe is pulled into line with the other toes, and you notice the big toe itself is pretty robust. The first metatarsal is really thick. The toe bones of the first digit or the big toe are really big and thick, and that's because it's a propulsory tool. We use that as push-off. When we walk, you do heel strike, roll across, toe off. And the toe off is what pushes you forward. Heel strike, toe off, heel strike, toe off. So having this really robust big toe gives us that propulsory forward movement. Chimps don't have that in the foot. And that's arrows to show you the really long toes. And note that the toe bones in the chimp are curved. You also see that in the hand. Curved phalanges, finger bones in the hand and the foot, because it's a grasping hand and a grasping foot. We also have in the human foot a longitudinal arch. Chimp feet, they're flat. Like your hand. You were to put your hand flat down on the ground, it's flat, almost flush completely with the surface, right? You would have to, in order to get your palm up off the ground, basically walk on your fingertips, or do like chimps do and knuckle walk, right? So we have a flat foot, we have this longitudinal arch. The longitudinal arch helps with the propulsion and also serves as a major shock absorber. Right? Not only do we walk, we also run. So both ways, the longitudinal arch absorbs the shock of the locomotor pattern. So these are all adaptations specific to bipedal locomotion. Now, an associated trait in the teeth is the maxillary canine mandibular first or third premolar honing complex that's present in apes. And this is from a chimpanzee. And what you have is the upper canine or the maxillary canine comes down and overlaps with the mandibular canine anterior to it, and then the third premolar, the P3, which is one of the only two premolars we have left. We've lost the first and second premolars through evolutionary history, overlap. And this creates what's called a honing complex. A honing complex, whereby the overlap with that maxillary canine with the mandibular premolar hones the back edge of that canine. You know what it means to hone an edge? Sharpens the edge, like you would sharpen a knife or sharpen a sword. Okay? That is to hone an edge. And so apes with these big canines, they have the CP3 honing complex, which sharpens the edge of the canine, makes them look fiercer, and makes them more useful for different types of behaviors. Okay? Humans, this is a human, natural dentition, it's natural bone, natural dentition, and when we look up close, here's that canine, that upper canine. Note it is not large and projecting, right? Here is that P3. Here's the P4. This is the mandibular canine. There is no CP3 honing complex. No CP3 honing complex, and you do not have a large projecting either maxillary or mandibular canine. So we believe, and this has been borne out in the fossil record, that this transition in dentition is an associated trait of bipedalism. Associated trait of bipedalism. When we find fossils with other evidence of bipedalism, those morphological traits that are necessary for bipedalism, we also tend to see a reduction or an absence of the CP3 honing complex. Yep, there's that canine. All right, and here's another view of the maxillary dentition. And as you can see, the chip on your right has a diastema. There's a big gap there. Humans do not have a gap between the lateral canine and the lateral incisor of the canine. And then you can also see, the honing facet right here on the back side of that maxillary canine, where it hones on the mandibular premolar. So distinct differences in dentition between human and chimpanzee. So we'd expect our ancestors to fall somewhere in between. This is just a quick summary of the features that we see in humans, and the features that we see in humans are things that are either necessary for bipedalism or associated with bipedalism. And then what we see in a chimpanzee or a gorilla, which are traits that are not associated with bipedalism because they use suspensory and quadrupedal locomotion. Right? And those are the traits you see there. And the differences can help us identify fossils that are part of our family tree because they share traits associated with or necessary for bipedalism. So this gets posted to Canvas, and I'll make sure that gets posted as an individual slide so you can see that really well. So ultimately, the required traits you need to have for obligatory bipedalism, the way you and I, or similar to how you and I walk, include the foramen magnum underneath the cranium, short and broad pelvis, medial angle at the knee, also known as the valgus angle. In the foot, a non-divergent first digit with short, straight toe bones or digits, and the longitudinal arch of the foot. Now we're going to find in the evolutionary record or the fossil record that we don't get every single one of these traits in the earliest hominins. And that is to be expected because evolution is a process. Evolution is a process. We also have associated traits, a small non-projecting canine, no CP3 complex or a diastema between the maxillary lateral incisor and the maxillary canine, and an arched palate or curved palate as opposed to the palate with the straight rows of teeth like we see in apes. Okay. Let's talk about the earliest hominins, their origins. How did they arise? Well, we've already looked at the Cenozoic era. We know that for our purposes, primate evolution starts in the earliest parts of the Paleocene, at about 66 million years ago. We have evidence for some of the earliest possible primates. And then we get the first hominins in the late Miocene at about 7-8 million years ago. We have fossil evidence for those first hominins. So that means we have in between the first possible primate and the first hominins almost 60 million years of evolutionary time. So what was going on in the meantime? We know that the Cenozoic era is a time with which mammals really proliferated. They just boomed, right? With the demise of the dinosaurs, mammals, which were already present, but they really took off and spread into all these newly opened niches and environments where they no longer had great big predators to deal with. Right? So primate evolution starts with the earliest part of the Cenozoic era, 66 million years ago. The Paleocene is about 10 million years long, 66 to 56 million years ago. This is where we see the first possible primates. They are, and the reason why they get called possible primates, it's becoming more and more likely that they are at least the last common ancestor before the split with mammals or true primates, still something that's debated. We have finds like Carpolestes simpsoni, where it looks like there is a divergent first digit in the hand, and we know that is the grasping hand of a primate. But we don't have like postorbital closure like we do in the most primitive primates, and some other attributes that are more similar to a last common ancestor mammal. We also have species or genera like Phyletic, and you notice they all look rather kind of like a cross between a little primate and a what would you say? A squirrel? Yeah. Right? So they're very similar in appearance, but they do have the grasping hand which we know is an important evolutionary step in the order Primates that you don't see in other animal orders, in other mammals. So here we have basically the rise of primates during the Paleocene. We'll move on to the Eocene, and this is where we have groups that are clearly primates. They have grasping hands, grasping feet. We have post-orbital bars, so you're getting that clear orientation to vision. And what we see among these first true primates in the Eocene are lemur and tarsier-like forms. Lemur, so think about lemurs, diurnal, like Oedipus or the Zapids, or the Almamiads are more like tarsiers. And so we see these guys during the Eocene. During the Oligocene, which is the next evolutionary epoch in the Cenozoic, we have the evolution of the anthropoids. And this is where we get the first true monkeys, Egyptopithecus, which comes from the Fayum Depression of Egypt, an area that is today a desert, but during the Oligocene was a lush, swampy, forested, like jungle area that had a whole slew of tropical animals that inhabited this. So in this time period, the Oligocene, is when we see the rise, the evolution of the ancestors of both the platyrrhines, or the monkeys of the Americas, and the catarrhines, the monkeys of Africa and Asia, as well as apes and our ancestors as well. So we have Egyptopithecus, and you can see Egyptopithecus looks an awful lot like a monkey, using quadrupedalism. You get the long tail, walking on tops of branches. Right? So during the Oligocene, we see the evolution of monkeys. This is where we get the first monkeys. And then during the Miocene, we see forms that have no tail. And what is a lack of a tail a hallmark of? What group of non-human primates? Apes, right? So clearly we get the rise of apes, or the evolution of apes, in the Miocene. Okay. Now, note this particular group, proconsul, is an excellent example of a Miocene ape. They're quadrupeds, not truly adapted for suspensory behavior like later apes, the apes that we know today, right? Although it does change during the Miocene, massive evolution in apes, and basically a fluorescence of apes during the Miocene, so you get to the late Miocene. So they're basically apes in many ways, but they awful lot like monkeys, still acting like monkeys, and then you get a shift during the Miocene. So basically, Paleocene, we have our first possible primates. Eocene, we have the first true primates that look like lemurs, lorises, and tarsiers. Then in the Oligocene, we get monkeys, and in the Miocene, we see apes. And there's a variety of ape forms during the Miocene, as well as monkeys. None of these particularly go extinct or anything like that. They continue on. So what we'll get is ultimately competition among all these different primate forms, competition between all these different primate forms. At the height of the Miocene, there were many different types of ape forms. And what you may note about this map is that there are 8 genera or ape groups in Africa, as we might expect, because there's apes in Africa today, right? We also have apes in Asia, which you probably also would expect, given that there are apes living there today. But we have quite a few species with apes in Europe, right? All the way across Europe. And what could explain this wide geographic distribution of apes during the Miocene? Could apes have been naturally adapted to life in Europe 10,000 years ago? 50,000 years ago? Nope. What do you think about the Miocene might have made it possible for apes to have such wide geographic distribution? It was a much warmer time period. So you get lush tropical environments extending much further north from the equator and much further south from the equator during this time period. So what we see is that during the Cenozoic, we have periods of warming and cooling, but the warmer temperatures meant that you had some areas that today are not tropical rainforest-like areas that were at that time period. So we have apes widespread and a wide variety of adaptations among the apes. And you gotta love some of the ape genus names. We got Oreopithecus here in the Mediterranean. Giganopithecus. Those guys actually were really big. Some people have hypothesized that the Sasquatch myth, or the, not real Sasquatch, but also Yeti, thank you, myth arises from some late surviving Giganopithecus. These guys are really big. Although they apparently ate bamboo. And so we have species throughout these areas, okay? So why do we only have a handful of ape species left today, right? What happened? Well, during the early Miocene, there were a lot of different ape genera, or groups of apes. But during the late Miocene, basically across the course of the Miocene, you have an initial, fluorescence and diversification and spread of the apes, but by the time you get to the late Miocene, there aren't very many apes groups left. By the time you get to the late Miocene, you basically have the ancestors of the modern apes today. The ancestors of the gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, the ancestors of the orangutans, the ancestors of the gibbons and primates. What could happen during the Miocene that would reduce the diversity among apes? One thing we see is a cooling and drying, that I'll talk to you about in just a second, but a major factor for ape species is that apes were competing with, who would apes be competing with? Diurnal, arboreal, equatorial, tropical regions. Who are apes competing with? Monkeys, right? And what you do not want to compete with is monkeys. Monkeys reproduce faster than apes. They don't need as much food as apes. Apes tend to be more larger body, right? And apes, like you and I, need to eat ripe fruit. Fruit's the preferred food, and when they eat it, they need ripe fruit. They're like us, right? If you eat unripe fruit, it makes your stomach hurt really bad. It's the tannins in the unripe fruit, and so they don't have quite the diversity of foods available to them because monkeys have digestive tracts that can tolerate unripe fruit. So monkeys can eat a slightly wider range of fruit. They can access the fruit resource before an ape can. And this means that they are really competitive. We already saw another group, the lorises, can't compete with monkeys, so they get character displacement and an evolution of a diurnal lifestyle, right? What happens to apes, for the most part, is we get extinction of almost all the ape genera that were present during the Miocene, right? And only the ancestors of the modern apes survive, and our ancestors. So competition with the old world monkeys is already going on. And then we also have a period of cooling and drying. So you can see that during the Eocene, it's getting really nice and warm, which means we're getting tropical climate across most of the planet, very wide swath. So that's why the first possible primate, from those earliest fossil finds, come from places like Montana, South Dakota, in the Americas, because that was once tropical forest. Right? So those very early forms over here, notice the sea level was much, much higher at this time, so there would have been much less land available. But during this warming, you get a proliferation, and then it starts to cool off, starts to warm up a little bit during the Miocene. And this is where the apes and the monkeys are just going crazy in terms of evolutionary diversity. But then we get that cooling episode. And here is at about 12 million years ago. We're really coming down on the curve with the cooling and drying, which means there's going to be a major retraction of the tropical forest. And that lines up not too bad with where gorillas probably split off from the last common ancestor for chimps, bonobos, and humans. Right, at about 12 million years. And then at about 10 million years, right here, that's where we really bottom out with the cooling and drying. Right? And cooling and drying periods have almost always been associated with major extinction events. It causes major climatic change worldwide, massive scale, and most species cannot adapt fast enough to those types of changes. However, this change at about 10 million years ago, again, or the sort of bottoming out, corresponds pretty nicely with the chimpanzee hominin split at about 9 million years ago. So we're seeing sort of correlation between major climatic change and genetic dates for the evolution of the split ancestral species into descendant groups. So the African hominoids, who survived and how? So basically, who survived this late Miocene cooling and drying period? Well, we know a ton of monkeys did, because there's monkeys all across the African continent, right? Monkeys highly adaptable, able to utilize a wide range of resources and so on and so forth. Monkeys do, but what about the hominoids? What about the apes? We know that the ancestors of the gorillas survived, the ancestors of chimps and bonobos survived, and our ancestors survived. How do they do that? How does that work? Well, gorillas reinvade the deep forest niche, right? They go back deep forest. They take up a vegetarian diet. They don't eat fruit. They don't eat fruit in zoos when it's provided to them. In the wild, they eat leaf, bamboo, stalks, stems, right? That is primarily what they eat. So they move back into the deep forest niche where they're surrounded by this food resource. Their lives are dictated by this food resource. slow moving, spend most of their time eating and napping during the day, interacting with each other, right? And you have the unimale, one male, multi-female groups in this population. That is how, so this is character displacement. This is gorillas, the ancestor of the gorillas, taking themselves out of competition with monkeys. What about chimps and bonobos? Chimps and bonobos basically keep on keeping on. Chimps and bonobos are smart. They can utilize a wide range of locomotor behaviors. They are small enough that they can be suspensory, right? They can hang underneath trees. And when you can hang underneath a branch, you can work your way out to the very end. And the terminal ends of branches are where the best fruit can be. And it can often be safer to do that underneath the branch than on top of a branch. Right? Chimps eat a wide range of foods, insects, nuts, roots, tubers, other animals, right? They hunt and catch monkeys. They do a wide range of things that monkeys just aren't capable of. So basically, chimps and bonobos use their cognitive abilities and their wide range of locomotor abilities to just exploit every resource. So even though they are in direct competition with the monkeys, they do just fine because they're able to exploit a wide range of resources, and they're just damn smart when it comes down to it. They can outsmart a monkey. So they also survive. They're arboreal, they're terrestrial, you name it, they sort of do it. And that allows them to survive as well. Our ancestors evolved a different locomotor behavior, bipedalism. A different locomotor behavior, bipedalism. And we will come back to that question next class period and talk a little bit about the different hypotheses for bipedalism. But before you go, I'm going to jump ahead a few slides here. And class participation today. People on Zoom need to do this class participation on Canvas.